Good afternoon. My name is Göran Marklund. I'm Deputy Director General at Vinnova, which is the Swedish innovation agency. It is a great honor to share with you our efforts to understand and orient policy in the current situation generated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we would classify as a perfect storm of systemic policy challenges, characterized by ubiquitous radical uncertainty. We already knew that we were facing a number of grand challenges of a systemic and mutually interdependent and reinforcing nature, where the climate crisis, of course, appeared to be the ultimate challenge. The pandemic made all these grand challenges and their interrelations acute and accordingly raised to the top of policy challenges. In turn, this revealed important analytical failures and policy failures to understand and develop policy frameworks to deal with such systemic challenges. We started a project at Vinnova with the ambition to monitor and analyze the immediate impacts of the pandemic on the Swedish innovation system in order to support the strategy development of Vinnova and of the Swedish government. We looked, of course, to what is done by international organizations and by other countries. We looked at scenarios such as the economic scenario from the OECD and tried to find sources of policy developments in different countries, first through the STIP COVID-19 Watch. We formulated three main analytical questions and opted for analytical questions of a deeper kind towards understanding transformative implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first question was how big, how fast, and how problematic are the decreasing R&D and innovation investments in Sweden due to the pandemic? The second one was how would the crisis impact global value chains and international production systems, and what would be the potential implications of that on the Swedish innovation system? And the third one was which policy measures for R&D, innovation, and competitiveness are implemented in other countries during the pandemic or to combat the pandemic, which we could learn from in the Swedish innovation policy. And the next step, which we're now taking, is to understand the system transformation impacts of the pandemic on a longer term. Based on previous analysis, we think that there are three megatrends that are driving the transformation in general and of production systems in particular. They are not only driving transformations, but they are also driving the importance of developing and implementing policies for generating system transformation towards sustainability and resilience. To begin with, we saw these impacts on the business sector. A majority of companies reduced turnover compared to the normal situation, of course. A contraction, especially in manufacturing and services, less so in construction, and risk for bankruptcies, especially felt in the service sector, and particularly in travel and hotel and restaurant sectors. Many short-term layoffs, which was part of the Swedish system to combat the economic crisis, and low and delayed investment power, including STI investments, although the rates are still very unclear in this, and the data on this is very difficult to find. As I said, real-time data on the developments of investments in general and of STI investments in particular are very difficult to find. But since Vinnova is the key national funder of R&D and innovation projects in Sweden, we could think of Vinnova's project portfolio as a microcosmos of the ambitions and actors of the Swedish innovation system, and then also as a source of data on emerging patterns in terms of SDI investments, for which sources that could deliver data in real time are basically non-existent in Sweden. So we did a survey in spring to all our projects, asking them how the crisis would impact their projects. And the responses indicated that it would in a majority of cases. We have then followed up the changes in the actual project data and could conclude during Q3 that 25% of the projects had been changed connected to the pandemic. The specific magnitude and directions of these changes are still under analysis, while also the data are continuously updated. Well, in our first phase of analysis, we saw the following, which is a mix of facts, weak signals, and the hypothesis. Of course, the global diffusion of COVID-19 in the first wave and then the second wave, we think we have noted improved preparedness, but still uncertain control of the pandemic itself. The sharp decrease of economic activities, of course, which we think have unclear short-term impacts on STI investments and very uncertain long-term impacts on innovation investments. The massive government crisis packages to deal with the pandemic, uphold social services, combat unemployment, and limit business failures. We think in the first wave had very limited STI focus, and in the second wave substantially increasing STI focus, but we still haven't really captured where this is done and how it is done in different countries. So this is a very interesting focus for us going forward. On the policy thinking, on the recovery perspectives, we see unevenness between regions. We see that the government stimulus packages and targeted measures could have substantial impacts on what is going on going forward. But the policy thinking, analysis, and policy agendas for innovation-driven recovery are still very unclear, and the transformation towards sustainability and resilience is still only in an emerging phase, we think. On the likely impacts in the medium term, we of course see the faster, broader, and deeper digitalization, which will probably be a very important path going forward. We see a changed priority balance between cost and resilience in the multinational companies with consequences for localization of production and organization of value chains. We see also increased legitimacy for government interventions in the economy. We think that the investments in digitalization and climate-motivated transformations are increasingly motivated as foundations for recovery and sustainable growth, but there is an important question mark there with where this is going to end up. The Swedish economy, R&D investments and innovation system is highly dependent on a number of Swedish-based multinational groups. Consequently, the development of global value chains are of key importance for Sweden, and the global value chains will potentially be significantly impacted as a consequence of the pandemic. So we asked ourselves, how would the crisis impact global value chains and international production systems, and which implications for strategies in the Swedish industries would this have on R&D investments and localization of STI activities? And which implications for Swedish policy strategies for recovery, innovation, competitiveness, and sustainability would this imply? Essentially, one of our key ambitions going forward is to understand this, impacts of policy measures in other countries and in Sweden on STI and other investment decisions in Sweden, and how COVID-19 has impacted policy measures within the frameworks of unprecedented stimulus packages and the potential implications of that on global value chains and STI investments in Sweden. Below you see a summarizing illustration of the Swedish business innovation system. I would leave out here a detailed discussion of this, but it's very interesting for us, of course, to understand in which parts of the system these have specific implications. Well, a preliminary conclusion or a hypothesis of importance for STI investments in Sweden and for the Swedish innovation system, we think, is the emerging or increased regionalization of production and maybe STI systems that could generate quite different challenges for Sweden in terms of competition of investments in localizations towards other European locations. Well, on global value chains and the changes in those and their implications for Sweden, we think we only know this so far, and that is not satisfying. The COVID-19 has generated very big disturbances in global value chains as far as we can see, and big negative impacts on economic growth, of course. The automotive industry, which is extremely important in Sweden, has been severely impacted. The electronic component suppliers were also highly impacted during the first wave. Access to critical competencies has been highly affected due to quarantines, layoffs, and temporary layoffs. Consequences in the medium and long term are very uncertain and depend on many mutually dependent factors. And this would strongly affect the conditions for competitiveness and attractiveness for investments, including STI investments in Sweden. Important to integrate the development of global value chains and their consequences in the analysis of different developments and outlooks going forward. We think that the new normal would be quite different from the old normal, and we think we have to rethink the way we address the analytical questions accordingly. One important conclusion we have drawn from our work is that our analytical frameworks, the usual data sources and analytical procedures are highly inadequate to understand the systemic challenges in general, and in particular to understand deeply interdependent systemic challenges impacted by a fundamental systemic shock as the pandemic. And we think that we are not alone in this. Policies to address the impact of COVID-19 on society, economy and future sustainability and resilience is of fundamental importance, yet it is tremendously challenging. So we wanted to understand and learn from policies in different countries and in Sweden, as these have evolved rapidly and involved extreme budget allocations during the pandemic. We asked ourselves which policy measures for R&D, innovation and competitiveness and sustainability are implemented in other countries now during the pandemic compared to Swedish policy measures, and what may be the implications for Swedish policy strategies for STI-based recovery, R&D, innovation and competitiveness going forward. We started out from the OECD's STIP COVID-19 watch. A key conclusion we have drawn is our inability to develop policies based on adequate systemic perspectives. This is not a new insight to us, but it has revealed itself as extremely problematic in the light of the COVID-19 shock. There is, we are convinced, an urgency of new innovation policy frameworks in order to deal with systemic transformations and particularly to generate transformative developments to effectively address our fundamental systemic challenges. Policy thinking, policy making and policy evaluations are, however, still heavily based on market failure frameworks and not as bold policy ambitions that are needed for recovery, sustainability and resilience. We think it is urgent to turn policy attention to system directionality failures, demand articulation failures, policy or governance coordination failures, and policy reflexivity or learning failures. One example, although it's too early to evaluate the Swedish COVID-19 strategy, in some respects it seems to have been working, but it has resulted in way too many deaths. And one important reason for this is most likely the organization of elderly care in Sweden, including the distribution of responsibilities between public agencies at different levels of the administrative system. This is most likely a systemic challenge that has not been understood or treated as a system. Now money is poured into the regions to attempt to remedy the situation, but a resilient system would need systemic redesign. Hopefully this would emerge on the policy agenda as such. Right now it seems as we have an important system governance failure in Sweden in this domain. To summarize on a more conceptual note, we have to develop, I think, the systems we live in into a new normal that we want to have in order not to become victims of a new normal that we would not like to see. However, policy thinking, policy measures and consensus-driven policy development tend to strongly drive us to think and act as if the old normal would come back, and as if this is something that we would really want to have. considering the grand challenges that we are facing. This, I think, is dangerous. The task is, however, tremendously challenging. We need to radically reinvent our analytical frameworks and policy frameworks to address the emergencies of the systemic challenges we're facing. This is truly challenging. Therefore, we need to do that in international collaboration. One important such arena is the OECD, where key developments in this direction are now happening. And I hope we could deepen our
So could you wrap up your talk?
I could, yeah. Good. Great. I was just saying there towards the end of that video that I think the co-creation of how we understand the systemic challenges and the developments going forward, and how we do frame the political answers to remedy and get the future that we would like to is very important. And those things are now happening. I think pandemic has been a tipping point, actually, for going that way. So I'm just happy to be here and honored to be invited. And I'm also very grateful because I think foresight and governance has never been more important and never more difficult. So I am just would like to share and learn from you. And that's what I actually said towards the end there. And the OECD is an arena where I'm also very active myself as a TIP chair, the innovation policy chair there. So just a plea to collaborate because I don't think we do understand what this is about, and I know that our politicians don't. So I'm in need for that.
Okay.
Thank you.